Welcome to LexTalks Legal Topics Simplified, bringing legal knowledge to life in an easy-to-understand way. Today we're diving into status and protection of refugees in India
Yeah.
and Indian Judiciary on refugee rights. It's a fascinating area, especially for law students like you,
Right.
because it gets right to the heart of how international law
Exactly.
intersects with the country's own legal system.
What makes this topic so intriguing is the contrast you see in India. On one hand, the country has this
Right.
long history of accepting refugees going all the way back to the partition. But on the other hand, their legal approach to refugee protection is, let's just say,
Yeah.
it raises some eyebrows.
Okay, so right off the bat, we've got a bit of a paradox.
Yeah.
Let's break this down.
Sure.
First things first, how does someone even qualify as a refugee? Legally.
Right.
It's not just anyone who crosses a border into India, right?
You're absolutely right. There are very specific international legal definitions that come into play. Now, even though India hasn't signed the major international agreement on refugees,
Okay.
that's the 1951 UN Refugee Convention and its 1967 protocol,
Right.
the definition laid out there is still crucial
Okay.
to understanding the global framework.
So even if India isn't bound by the convention, the definition still matters. Why is that?
Because it sets a sort of global standard. That convention defines a refugee as someone with a well-founded fear of persecution based on things like their race, religion, nationality, social group, or political opinion. Think about what that means. It's not just about fleeing hardship. It's about proving you're at risk
Right.
because of who you are.
That sounds like a pretty high bar to clear,
Yeah.
especially if someone had to leave their country quickly and doesn't have a lot of documentation.
It can be incredibly challenging, and we'll get into the specifics of establishing a refugee claim a bit later. But it's important to remember that not every foreigner in India is a refugee. You've got tourists, students,
Right.
temporary workers, even people who might be in the country illegally.
Right.
Each of those categories has its own set of legal rules.
And then you have a whole other layer of complexity within India itself. Our research mentioned internally displaced persons, like Kashmiris, who have fled their homes but are still within India's borders.
Exactly. The distinction between a refugee and other types of foreigners is crucial for understanding India's legal approach.
Okay.
And here's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
India doesn't have a dedicated national refugee law.
Wait, so if there's no specific law for refugees, how are their rights protected? Does that mean they have no legal recourse?
That's where the Indian Judiciary comes in.
Okay.
In the absence of a clear legislative framework, the courts have often stepped in to protect refugee rights. We've got some landmark cases where high courts...
Okay, and even the Supreme Court have drawn on international principles to ensure refugees are treated fairly. Think things like the right to life,
Right.
the right to not be arbitrarily detained, and the right to not be sent back to a place where they'd face danger.
So the courts are essentially filling a gap left by the legislature. But how does this play out in practice?
Right.
Our research mentioned different refugee groups in India. Tibetans, Sri Lankan Tamils, Rohingya.
Yeah.
Did they all have the same experience?
That's a great question because each group's experience highlights just how complex
Right.
and often inconsistent India's approach to refugees can be. Let's start with the Tibetans.
Okay.
They've had a long-standing presence in India, even establishing a government in exile in Dharamshala. They're often seen as a model refugee community,
Okay.
relatively well-integrated and generally accepted.
But then you have the Sri Lankan Tamils,
Right.
many of whom are still living in camps decades after fleeing the civil war.
Yeah.
That doesn't sound like successful integration. It really underscores the challenges of long-term displacement. And then you have the Rohingya fleeing persecution in Myanmar, facing a much more uncertain future in India.
Okay, so we're seeing a real spectrum of experiences here. But what are the actual steps someone has to take to establish a refugee claim in India?
Right.
Given this somewhat unclear legal landscape,
Yeah.
how does that even work?
Let's dig into that now, because the process isn't as straightforward as you might think.
Oh, yeah?
Proving that well-founded fear of persecution is key.
Right.
And it often involves presenting a lot of evidence, things like documentation, consistent testimony,
Right.
even corroborating information from international human rights groups.
So it's a complex puzzle. But before we unpack the process of claiming asylum in India, let's take a moment to consider one crucial factor: the role of the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency. Even though India hasn't signed the Refugee Convention, the UNHCR still has a presence in the country.
They absolutely do, and their role is incredibly important. In a country without a dedicated refugee law, the UNHCR often acts as a sort of lifeline for refugees who arrive in India.
Okay, so we've laid the groundwork here. We've got this intriguing mix of history,
Yeah,
international law,
right.
and domestic legal complexities.
Yeah,
It seems like the Indian judiciary is really walking a tightrope,
yeah,
trying to uphold certain human rights principles
exactly.
while navigating a somewhat ambiguous legal terrain. But let's get into the nitty-gritty now.
Wow.
How does the UNHCR actually help refugees in India?
Okay.
What power do they really have? So we've got refugees arriving in India, often fleeing, desperate situations,
Right.
and they're entering a legal system
Yeah.
that's, shall we say,
Yeah.
a bit of a puzzle. What's the first step
Right.
for someone seeking asylum? Do they just walk into a government office and declare themselves a refugee?
It would be nice if it were that simple.
Right.
But unfortunately, it's not. Remember, India doesn't have that dedicated refugee law.
Yeah.
So there's no single streamlined process. But practically speaking,
Okay.
the first point of contact for many refugees is actually the UNHCR,
Okay.
the UN Refugee Agency.
That's interesting. So even though India hasn't signed the Refugee Convention,
Right?
the UNHCR is still operating within the country.
Yeah.
What exactly do they do?
They play a crucial role. The UNHCR can conduct interviews with refugees, assess their claims.
Yeah.
And if they determine someone meets the definition of a refugee, they can issue documentation. This isn't the same as official legal status in India,
Right.
but it can be incredibly helpful.
Helpful in what way? What does that UNHCR documentation actually do for a refugee?
Think of it as a form of recognition. It can help refugees access basic services like healthcare or education.
Okay.
It can also be really important in preventing deportation while their case is being assessed.
Okay.
And if a refugee's case ends up in court, having that UNHCR recognition
Right.
can strengthen their argument.
So it's not a magic bullet, but it does carry some weight.
Right.
But ultimately, it sounds like the final decision about a refugee's fate still lies with the Indian government, right?
Exactly. And this is where we need to talk about another piece of the puzzle. The Foreigners Act of 1946.
Okay.
This is a very broad law that gives the Indian government wide-ranging powers when it comes to dealing with foreigners, including refugees.
Okay, so this is where things could get a bit tricky. We've already established that India hasn't signed the Refugee Convention.
Right.
So there's no legal obligation to protect refugees from being sent back to a dangerous situation.
Right.
And now we have this Foreigners Act,
Right.
which gives the government a lot of discretion.
You're picking up on the tension here.
Right.
The Foreigners Act can be a double-edged sword.
Mm.
On one hand, it can be used to detain and deport refugees,
Right.
even those recognized by the UNHCR.
Okay.
On the other hand, it also provides a framework for granting long-term visas, which are essential for refugees who want to rebuild their lives in India.
So it sounds like a lot depends on how the government chooses to interpret and apply this act.
Right.
That might explain why we see so much variation
Yeah.
in how different refugee groups are treated.
That's a key takeaway here.
Right.
The political climate perceptions about different refugee groups, and even concerns about resource constraints.
Right.
All of these factors can influence how the Foreigners Act is used. Our research pointed out that while India has a history of welcoming refugees,
Right.
there's also this growing concern about the potential strain on resources,
Yeah.
especially given the lack of a clear legal framework.
This is where the real-world impact of these legal complexities becomes clear. We're not just talking about abstract concepts here. We're talking about people's lives,
Right.
their safety, their
Yeah.
futures. It sounds like navigating this system would be incredibly daunting, especially for someone who's just arrived in a new country,
Right.
possibly traumatized and disoriented.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that even if a refugee manages to secure a long-term visa, their challenges don't end there. Integration into Indian society,
Right.
accessing education and employment opportunities, overcoming language barriers, and dealing with potential discrimination. These are all ongoing hurdles.
So you got this multi-layered challenge.
Yeah.
The legal uncertainties.
Right.
The bureaucratic hurdles, and then the social and economic barriers to integration. It's a lot for anyone to face. But let's shift our focus now to the heart of the matter. How does the Indian judiciary specifically step in to protect refugee rights? You mentioned some landmark cases.
Right.
Can we dive into those?
Let's do that, because what's fascinating is how the courts have often drawn on international law, even in the absence of a binding treaty obligation to uphold certain fundamental rights for refugees. And some of these cases have set important precedents that have shaped the landscape of refugee protection in India.
This is where it gets really interesting for us aspiring lawyers.
Yeah.
Let's hear about these cases and how they've impacted the lives of refugees in India. So we've got this complex legal landscape, a powerful Foreigners Act, and the UNHCR trying to navigate it all. But what about the Indian courts themselves? What are some concrete examples of how they've actually stepped in to protect refugee rights?
Let's look at a landmark case, NHRC v. State of Arunachal Pradesh. This involved Chakma refugees. And while they weren't refugees who had crossed international borders, the Supreme Court's ruling was significant. They affirmed the state's obligation to protect the life and liberty of every human being within its territory, regardless of their citizenship.
So even though it wasn't a classic refugee scenario, the principle they established has implications for how India treats all those seeking refuge within its borders.
Exactly. And this principle has echoed in other judgments. For example, the Madras High Court ruled that Sri Lankan Tamil refugees shouldn't be sent back to Sri Lanka against their will. This aligns with the principle of non-refoulement, a cornerstone of the UN Refugee Convention, even though India hasn't signed the convention itself.
It's almost like the courts are nudging India towards aligning with international standards, even without a formal treaty obligation. But how far can they go? What are the limitations of this judicial activism, so to speak?
That's a key question. The courts can interpret laws and uphold fundamental rights, but they can't create new laws. So there's a limit to how much they can change the overall system. And their rulings are often dependent on individual cases and specific facts. But those judgments can still set important precedents and shape the legal landscape.
It sounds like a fascinating dance between the judiciary and the legislature. But let's bring this back to the human element. Even with these court victories, our research highlighted the immense day-to-day challenges refugees face in India. Access to healthcare, education, employment, just basic survival stuff.
Because protecting the right to life and liberty doesn't stop at preventing deportation. It's about ensuring a dignified existence, a real chance to rebuild your life. And as we've discussed, many refugees lack basic documentation, which throws up roadblocks at every turn.
One source even mentioned that without proper documents, it's nearly impossible to open a bank account or rent an apartment. It's a vicious cycle that makes integration and self-sufficiency so much harder.
And then you layer on the economic realities. India has a vast population with its own needs and challenges. Allocating resources to refugees, especially those viewed as, illegal immigrants, can be a tough sell politically.
So we end up with this complex web of legal uncertainties, bureaucratic hurdles, and socioeconomic barriers. It's a lot to unpack. But as future lawyers, understanding these issues is critical.
Absolutely.
What can I say?
Absolutely. Whether you end up working directly on refugee rights, advising policymakers, or simply advocating for a more just system, this deep dive has hopefully given you a solid foundation.
This episode has certainly been eye-opening for me. We've gone from the broad strokes of international law to the very specific challenges faced by refugees on the ground. We've seen the judiciary's crucial role and the limitations they face. But I'm left with one final thought. Is the current framework, even at the international level, really equipped to deal with the refugee crises of the 21st century?
That's a great question to ponder. The 1951 Refugee Convention, as important as it is, might need updating. What about people fleeing climate change or economic collapse? Do they fit the traditional definition of a refugee? These are the kinds of challenges that you, as the next generation of legal minds, will need to grapple with.
It's a lot to consider, but that's what makes this field so compelling. So for all you aspiring lawyers out there, don't just study the law. Question it. Challenge it. And help shape a more just and humane world.
Well said. Because the fight for refugee rights isn't just about legal arguments. It's about human dignity and the kind of world we want to live in.
Thanks for joining us on LexTalks.
Yeah.
We hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and given you plenty to think about.
And remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Keep learning,
Right.
keep questioning,
Right.
and keep pushing for a world where everyone, regardless of where they come from, has a chance at a safe and dignified life.
Subscribe to LexTalks
Yeah.
and keep exploring the law.